Good evening. Welcome to Marquis Mondays, a project of the Lafayette 200 Bicentennial that features a variety of individuals who have authored books related to the Marquis de Lafayette. The 1781 Battle of Yorktown was a pivotal battle in the Revolutionary War, and tonight's author has written a book about the Yorktown victory that won Americans' independence. The book, The World Turned Upside Down. Author Tim Grove believes the past is filled with amazing stories waiting to be told. He writes from 25 years of experience as a public historian and museum professional, working at some of America's most visited history museums, including 3 Smithsonian museums. His career memoir, A Grizzly in the Mail and Other Adventures in American History, highlights some of the fun projects he's worked on. More recently, he's been writing history-focused nonfiction books for ages 10 to 14. His book, First Flight Around the World, was a finalist for the 2016 Yalza Excellence in Nonfiction Award. Besides telling stories from different perspectives, he seeks to help all ages understand the historical process and to see that the past is vitally relevant. Tim, welcome to our broadcast.
Thank you, Kathleen. It's very nice to be with you all. I'm coming to you from Falls Church, Virginia, where I live, which is about 7 miles as the crow flies to the U.S. Capitol building. But I am from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I was born in Lancaster at Lancaster General Hospital, and I went to Conestoga Valley. So I understand most of you watching have a connection or are in Lancaster or Westchester counties, maybe. And so I just wanted to say I get back there quite often and have family there. And so it's nice to be speaking to a hometown crowd, kind of. So the book I'm talking about, let me get it up here. This is what it looks like. And I'm going to be using a PowerPoint because the book is filled with images, historic images. I don't use illustrators. This book is targeted to ages 10 to 14, but I have to say adults like my books as well. And I just had an email from a 75-year-old woman who found it in Colonial Williamsburg's bookstore. And she said she looked at 50 books and chose that one. And she had no idea it was targeted to young people, young readers. She said it doesn't read that way. And I'd love to hear that, of course. She wondered why it was on the young reader shelf. I said, I don't have any control over that. Let's see. So, there we go. That's what the book cover looks like. World Turned Upside Down. So the question that most authors get asked before any other question is, why did you write the book you did? What fascinated you about the topic? And why are you wanting to spend, you have to really, any author devotes many years to research and writing, and you have to like the topic. You can't find out halfway through that you really don't enjoy the topic. So with Yorktown, I have to say what drew me in was a cover story that was on the Colonial Williamsburg magazine, Trend and Tradition. I'm guessing some of you get that. I think it's an excellent magazine. And they had a cover story on a man named James Lafayette, who was an African-American man who served as a spy for Lafayette during the Yorktown campaign. And that just to me was a disconnect. How did Lafayette find this man? I was just so intrigued by that combination of factors that I decided maybe there's a book in here. And I always try to write historic events from multiple perspectives because history is about multiple perspectives. And so obviously a major player in the Yorktown story, besides George Washington, is the guy that you're focused on in your series, this guy, who was very young at the time. But I hadn't realized there was a lot about Lafayette that I didn't realize when I started researching the book, such as his backstory, how he came to America. And I also didn't realize his Virginia campaign. That just doesn't get a lot of attention, I think, in history classes. And the fact that He went down to Virginia. George Washington sent him down to Virginia in February 22nd. He left New York City, the New York area where he was encamped, to go to Virginia. And the person he was going after was Benedict Arnold, who had just left the Americans and become a traitor. And the British gave him an army to lead in Virginia. And so at the beginning of the new year in 1781, Benedict Arnold appears in Virginia and startles Virginians and boldly proclaims who he is, which surprised me as well. But anyway, Lafayette went down there to try to do what he could to stop Benedict Arnold, who was rampaging in central Virginia. So the other players, of course, are George Washington, who does not get down to Virginia until September of 1781. Those of you who know about Yorktown, of course, you know your history that October 19th was the surrender. So the siege of Yorktown happened the weeks prior to that. So 1781, we're talking about. And of course, the bad guy in the story, there always has to be a bad guy, is Cornwallis, who came up from North Carolina. I'm not going to go into a lot of strategy. Basically, what I want to focus on in the next couple minutes is the relationship between James, the spy, and Lafayette. Those are the things I want to focus on. So here's James Lafayette. It's amazing. It's just amazing today that an enslaved man who wasn't later in life, but there's a portrait actually existing in a museum collection. This portrait is in the Valentine Museum collection in Richmond. Um, so this is the man who eventually became a spy for Lafayette. And Lafayette was desperate for manpower for soldiers in the military in Virginia, and the obvious choice would have been to arm enslaved men and African American men, and but Virginia legislators would not have that, and so that was not possible. They said no. But Lafayette had come from the north, and he had seen northern militias and the Continental Army. He saw African American men, soldiers serving in those areas, and so he was greatly frustrated. And so this image is very popular. You've probably seen it around. It was drawn by a French soldier at Yorktown, and it portrays, historians believe it is one of the very first portrayals of an African American soldier in the American military ever. And so he's in the uniform of the 1st Rhode Island, which was one of the early units formed when the Rhode Island legislature created this unit just for African American men. I'm trying to find the date of that. It was 1778, I believe. Yeah, February 1778 is when the 1st Rhode Island Regiment was formed. And this is a modern artist rendition of what they look like. But James would have been very surprised. James, who grew up in Tidewater, Virginia, New Kent County, which, if you've been to Williamsburg, New Kent County is about midway between Richmond and Williamsburg, and 64 goes right through New Kent County. He would have been surprised when at some point he saw the Black soldiers in the Continental troops when they arrived eventually at Yorktown. So here's a map of Virginia. I wish I could see you all because I would ask how many know a lot about the campaign in Virginia that I'm talking about that preceded Yorktown, because I just don't think it's that well known. Because it wasn't any major battles, but that is the time that the British were chasing Governor Jefferson and went all the way out to Charlottesville, and were going up the mountain to get Jefferson when he was escaping with his family down the mountain on the other side. So some of you may have heard that story. So there you can see all of the main areas, and Yorktown, of course, is the star. It's hard to say where it is, but hopefully, if you see Williamsburg, Yorktown is just to the east of it. So the challenge of telling James's story, first of all, I had to decide if I could even tell his story because I write nonfiction. This is nonfiction, and so I can't be making things up, right? And so I had to see if there was enough information to make him a compelling character. And he was a spy, which helped. So a spy usually has a shadowy existence. So he does have a shadowy existence. But the challenges, of course, are that spies don't leave evidence. Historic evidence, historical sources are not, they don't leave sources. And neither did most African Americans. Enslaved people did not, a lot of them did not know how to write, but James did know how to write, read and write. But he didn't leave anything, any personal items, personal writings, or anything like that. So that was the big question. And there are, and I will say in a little while, is there were three big holes in James's story, which I had to work around. But I want to read to you a segment from the book where I had to imagine how James and Lafayette got started together. So this is from the book. James, an enslaved man from New Kent County, wasn't sure he had heard correctly. Standing before him was a tall, thin, boyish man, the famous French Major General, the Marquis de Lafayette. He looked splendid in a clean blue, white, and gold uniform, his reddish blonde hair visible under his black tricorn hat. Listening hard through the general's thick accent, James thought Lafayette was asking him to become a spy and go behind enemy lines to a British officers' camp. The British would never suspect an enslaved man would be gathering intelligence for the patriot cause. Most slaves did not know how to read, but James did. Lafayette said James would report directly to him. What questions ran through James's mind? More than anything, he likely wanted answers to two. What would happen to him if he got caught? And could he earn his freedom if he was successful? Everyone knew the answer to the first, death. The British were known to execute spies. They had hanged several American spies in the North earlier in the war. Second question, a very complicated one. Certainly, Lafayette had no power to give James his freedom. He wasn't even American. James would need approval from his owner, William Armistead, even to participate in such a scheme. Even if James was successful as a spy and Armistead wanted to free him, Virginia law allowed owners to free a slave only for very specific reasons, and it required permission of the governor. But in this unsettled time, everything depended on the outcome of the war. There was no guarantee he would receive his freedom. The worlds that James and Lafayette inhabited could not have been more different. James had been born into slavery on Armistead's plantation in New Kent County in the Tidewater region of Virginia. He didn't know the exact year he was born, around 1748. That made him about 33 years old. He had grown up in the Virginia countryside, surrounded by an enslaved community that surely dreamed about what life would be like as a free people. The Armisteads were merchants who bought and sold goods. James' owner, William, had been hired as Virginia's commissary of stores. He bought and tracked all the provisions for the state's militia, and he had recently coordinated the move of the public store from Williamsburg upriver to Richmond, the new capital. James was his personal servant and was familiar with many aspects of the business. Anyway, I'm guessing most of you, if not all of you, know a lot about Lafayette's background and where he grew up, and his connection to the French court. And so it's interesting to imagine how different their lives were. So I talked about the holes in James's story. Um, and the first one is, when did James begin his service for Lafayette? That we don't know. I couldn't say a date. Could not pinpoint a certain date when they connected. And I don't really know. We don't really know for sure. I mean, I'm sure that Lafayette would have been the one to reach out to James with the idea. I don't think James would ever have approached Lafayette with the idea to be a spy. But I wish I knew the details of that. So that's one of the holes in the story. Um, there are two mentions of James in letters that Lafayette wrote to George Washington, and I wanted to read those briefly. I mean, we're talking about really scarce evidence here that I had to go on. So, one is from July 31st, 1781, and Lafayette is writing to Washington, and he doesn't, certainly, he's writing about a spy, so he's never going to mention a name. But he says, of course, this is the letter that you see on the screen in Lafayette's handwriting. He says, a correspondent of mine, servant to Lord Cornwallis, writes on the 26th of July at Portsmouth and says his masters, Cornwallis and Tarleton, are still in town, but expect to move. The greatest part of the army is embarked. My lord's baggage is yet in town. So basically, he's talking about movement of the British troops and giving a heads up that the British are moving from Portsmouth to Yorktown. But he's just saying a correspondent of mine. But historians do think he's referring to James. And so the second letter, the only other evidence of Lafayette writing of James in this at this time period is from August 25th, and it's another letter that Washington wrote, or Lafayette wrote to Washington. And he says, the enemy have abandoned their forts at Ivy, Kemp's Landing, Great Bridge, and Portsmouth. Their vessels with troops and baggage went round to York, which is Yorktown. I have got some intelligence by the way of this servant I once mentioned. And so again, historians think it was James, but of course, there's no way to know, really. So those are the two letters that still exist. As you can tell, maybe, I like to find fun primary source materials. This is a fun cartoon that the British drew mocking the French. So you see Rochambeau, who was the French leader, is on the right there. And I just love to include cartoons and things like that when I can find them, because I think it's important to know that historical source materials are not only letters, but they're also things like cartoons. So the majority of James's story that we know of comes from two sources, and those are his application for manumission after the war and his application for a pension after the war. So I should explain, it gets very confusing by saying his name's James Lafayette. Obviously, he did not have a surname when he was enslaved, so it was just James. And we know for a fact that he did not, when he finally did receive his freedom, he did not choose his master's name, Armistead, but he decided to choose the surname Lafayette, which I'm sure he was the only person in Virginia who had the surname Lafayette, and it's neat that he honored Lafayette that way. And so this document here is after the war. He petitioned, like I said, for manumission, which was a process, and he got Lafayette to write this letter of testimony. So this is in Lafayette's hand, saying it describes what James did for him. So this is one of the best sources of information about what James did, what his role was during the war. And he also had some handkerchiefs made with this picture of James on, and they were spread on Lafayette's tour which you're celebrating the 200th anniversary of. They met up again, but I'll say that, hold that for a little later. But so there were three holes in James's story. When did James begin service for Lafayette? We don't know. Where was James during the siege of Yorktown and the surrender? We do not know where he was. He was most likely in the Patriot camp, the Continental camp, which is where Lafayette was. But, I tried to find out where Lafayette was or get quotes from Lafayette about the surrender ceremony. This, of course, I should say, is the famous John Trumbull painting that's in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, which most people are familiar with this one. Another one I found, which I'd never seen before, is this one, which is very detailed, as you can see. It's a French painting, and it was done, I think it was given to the king, King Louis, of the surrender ceremony as well. But I love this perspective because it's so detailed and it's huge. And I think I saw it, a version of it in the National Museum of American History when they did a special exhibit about Yorktown. But I think it's in a private collection. I can't remember if it's in America or France, but I'm wondering how many of you have seen this. I'd be curious to know how many of you've seen this. So we don't know where James was during I have to think that James would have gone with the crowds. There you can see the crowds in the foreground, the spectators who came from all over to watch the surrender ceremony. I have to think James was there watching as well. Whoops. And then the final hole in the story is what exactly was the nature of his work for Cornwallis? So there were hints in those two letters that he was perhaps a double agent for Cornwallis. He might have, Cornwallis might have asked him to do a little spying for the British. Um, and so we don't really know that, but I have to be careful when I'm writing to not to verify everything, all my sources. And so there's a story that is out there that after the Battle of Yorktown, the officers on both sides got together and had a meetup in one of the tents, Continental officer tents. And Cornwallis apparently came to that. And James was there, and the story says that Cornwallis was shocked to see James in the Continental Army camp. And so, but it's not verified well enough that I felt like I could tell that story in the book, so I didn't. But it's a great story, isn't it? So, I talked a little bit about the primary sources I like to use, and I have to share one of my favorite sources that I found in this book for the book. And I talk a little bit about spying and the fact that early in the Revolution, George Washington wrote that there is one evil I dread, and that is British spies. That was in a letter March 17th. Sorry, a March 1776 letter to Josiah Quincy. So during the French and Indian War, which Washington had been involved with in the early battles on the Western frontier, he had witnessed the British spy techniques, I guess, and recognized the advantages and of gathering good intelligence. And so when I'm guessing Lafayette wrote to him and said, I really need a better handle of what the British are doing in Virginia, where they are and things like that. I'm sure that George Washington would have encouraged uh, Lafayette to recruit a spy or several spies. And um, that could be George Washington could be the reason why he recruited James. There were several other enslaved spies we know of in Virginia operating at the time. I mentioned those in the book, but again, not a lot of material about them. So, talking about spying and the mails getting intercepted by the enemy, this is one of my favorite letters. And of course, everyone knows about George Washington's teeth, and there is some information about his teeth in this book. But this is a letter that George Washington wrote from New York, New Windsor, which I think is New York. Um, and there you can see the date, May 29th, 1781. And he was writing to his dentist who was in Philadelphia. And he was basically writing for supplies because he was saying that he was not planning to be down in the Philadelphia direction anytime soon. So he needed certain supplies for his teeth to keep his teeth clean. And so when the British intercepted this, they had to determine if it was an authentic letter because both sides planted fake letters, false evidence, to confuse the other side. And so they had to determine that. But what this told them is that they had heard that the Americans were considering doing a campaign in the South, maybe meeting up with armies in Virginia, or possibly attacking the British were still occupying New York City. And so a lot of the subterfuge was trying to get the British to think before they marched secretly to Virginia that they were going to attack the British in New York, that they were gearing up for a major attack on New York City. And so this is just the amazing thing to me, and why I love this letter so much, is that it exists today. It's in the University of Michigan Library in the Clinton papers. General Clinton, of course, was the main British general. And it's in his papers, which are at the University of Michigan Library. So I think that is so incredible that this letter that Washington wrote to his dentist exists and is in Michigan. Things happen like that. They sources spread out all over the place. You never know where they're going to be. So, um, there are other favorite sources too. Other very interesting sources. Let's see. One is this collection of maps, these hand-drawn maps by a Frenchman. I can't remember his name at the moment, but I'm sure some of you have seen these maps. They're just beautiful of where the French troops were in America. This is the orange circle there in the middle is Manhattan. So this shows the British and French encampments to the east, to the right on the map. I think those are all the sources I have to show you. But again, the book is filled with many, many primary source materials. And I'm going to turn myself on. Let's see. Stop share. There, hopefully you can all see me now. So that's just a teaser of some of the things in the book that I found most interesting, and I hope that you will be interested to learn more about James's story. It is in the curriculum of 3 states, which I think is very interesting, and I'm glad it is. His story is in Virginia's curriculum, Tennessee, and I think Texas. But you can understand why his story resonates with people because the courage that it took for him to take the risk and not knowing whether he would gain his freedom or if he would get caught. And any spy has to make decisions like that. But for him, it was even more layers of risk, I would say. So we do know that he lived out his life. He did eventually receive his freedom from the Virginia legislature. It took him a little while and it took some prodding from Lafayette, but he did. He got some money, opened a grist mill, I think, or worked at a grist mill in New Kent County. He was able to buy his wife and children, and for a time he was considered technically their master, but he um, did buy freedom for his family. And there's even question about where he died. Some sources say Baltimore, some say Virginia. So um, I'm not sure we even know where he's buried. But if you're going to Williamsburg sometime and you want to go to New Kent County, to New Kent Courthouse, it's just maybe 10 minutes off of 64. You can go there and you can see historical markers that are depicting the story of James Lafayette. So um, he didn't leave a lot of evidence, but I'm glad that Virginia has thought his story very important. And I will say one more thing. If you go to Colonial Williamsburg, they have a character interpreter. You know, they have actors who play different people from the past in Williamsburg, and they have a Lafayette character, which I'm sure many of you have seen. But they also have a James character, and occasionally they will do programs together talking about this. And I did talk to them as part of my research for this book. So I think I'll end now and open it to questions. If anyone has a question.
DAR Region, Debbie Thompson will now present questions to Tim. Debbie, welcome.
It's a pleasure to see everyone tonight. Okay, we do have some questions that came in. Robert wants to know, can you comment about the details about James Lafayette and his pension application?
You mean what kind of details are in the
That's,
pension application?
I
So,
guess, yeah.
so I think I can't remember the details to be honest, but I think there are number amounts for what pension he was earning, and I think that must be the source for where he ended up in later life. because the application for manumission would not include that, I don't think. So they are online, both of them. The application for manumission and the application for pension are, I think, online in Virginia government records.
Okay. We also would like to know, please confirm that Cornwallis never mentions that he asked James Lafayette or other blacks to be a double spy or any mention of him.
I have never seen any mention by the British officers of using enslaved people, enslaved men, as spies. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I've never seen any.
Okay. Do we know if George Washington ever met James?
We don't, no. But I have to, I mean, Lafayette was close to Washington, of course, very close. So I would love to think, but because this wasn't fiction, I couldn't write about a meeting. But if I was writing fiction, it would be fun to imagine the meeting between Lafayette introducing George Washington to James and saying how vital he was to the whole effort in Yorktown.
Okay.
And I would love to know what George Washington thought of using African enslaved men as spies, you know?
Okay. All right. Robert asked, please mention if Lafayette met James during his 1824-25 visit to America.
Oh, thank you for bringing that up. I forgot to mention that. So yes, there's several newspapers reported that on his tour in 1824, I think it was 1824, was it 1825? Um, when he toured the Yorktown battlefield, he was looking out at the crowd and spotted a man that he recognized, and the man was James. And he got out of his carriage and gave him a hug, and they had a reunion right there. And so several papers reported that, and so definitely a Richmond paper reported that, and so it's a nice moment of reunion.
Okay. What did you find most interesting about the Yorktown story?
So many things I found interesting. I guess my favorite chapter is probably the march from New York to Yorktown. The French and American armies had to be stealthy, and you think, how on earth, given the footprint of camping out, encampments every night, and the animals, the food they had to take along with them, and just the noise of thousands of men marching, and how could they keep that a secret from the British? But just everything they did around New York City. So it was a matter of getting far enough so that the British couldn't catch up with them. So once they were in Philadelphia, the British couldn't catch up to them if the British were coming from New York. And so what they did around New York City to try to get away without the British knowing is they made it look like they were attacking New York City. They were planning to attack New York City. So the French, they built fake bread ovens because the French always built bread ovens wherever they were encamped because they had to have their bread. And they built fake bread ovens and they went around looking for supplies for bread to make the British think that the French were encamping right outside New York City. So that's just one of various different subterfuge techniques that they used, which I mentioned in the book. But if you're not familiar with all of those ways that Washington tried to outsmart the British, it's worth investigating because they're so very interesting, I think. So I guess that would be my answer is that
Okay.
secret effort.
All right. Robert would like to know what type of service, etc., did he get, and how much did he get? I guess that's pertaining to the pension.
Yeah, I don't remember as far as numbers. Um, the sad thing is the Virginia legislature passed a law in 1780, I want to say 82, but I'm not sure exactly. Um, there were several African Americans who fought for Virginia during the war, and so the legislation gave them their freedom, but spies did not count. So they didn't say at that time they said James did not count in that, so it didn't apply to him, which was crazy.
Okay. Um, can you talk a little about the research process and where did you do most of your research?
So obviously I went to Yorktown, walked the battlefield, and um, obviously this is a kid's book, so I I couldn't I had to think carefully about how much strategy I went into. I do talk a little bit about strategy and the fact that it was a siege, not a battle, even though it's usually called the Battle of Yorktown. But things like fire ships and the flying hot shot that they fired from cannons, things like that, kids would really like. So I included those stories. But so Yorktown, I had a tour in the rain of this town of Yorktown with the park ranger who was very, very gracious. Um, but I spent a lot of time so if you haven't been to the State of Museum built the American Revolution Museum there at Yorktown, which is kind of, if you've been to the one in Philadelphia, it's similar to that in a way. The story is a little more focused on Yorktown, but it still covers, I think, the whole revolution. But it's an excellent museum, and they have an archives there, so I spent a lot of time in that building. One thing I will tell you is that as a youngster, I was at the bicentennial of Yorktown when President Reagan was there and the French President Mitterrand came, and it was a huge reenactment of the surrender ceremony. I begged my parents to take me there, and so I have memories of that, which is a fun memory to have.
Okay. How can individuals purchase your book?
It's available anywhere you purchase books.
Okay.
Any bookseller that you normally use should have it.
Okay. And in closing, what was the closing message you would like to send regarding the Battle of Yorktown?
It was In some ways, it was a miracle how the pieces, I say it was a puzzle. The pieces of the puzzle just came together and Washington had to put them in place. But the fact that the French Navy was willing to come from Bermuda, I think is where it was, and came at the right time, but Washington had to get his troops moving from New York area and he didn't, when they started moving, he didn't know about the naval battle where the French gained control of the Chesapeake Bay. I mean, that was the linchpin in the whole Yorktown. Yorktown could not have happened if the French Navy had not won the battle with the British Navy, with the Royal Navy. And it was all about timing, and everything had to happen in the right time, correct order for it to be a success. Lafayette had to hold Cornwallis there. If Cornwallis sensed that he was being trapped, he could have escaped somehow and went down to North Carolina. So many things, so many pieces had to happen in the correct order. That's what I think is so amazing about the siege of Yorktown and the story of Yorktown.
Okay. Well, thank you on that, Kathleen.
Debbie, thanks so much. And Tim, our deepest appreciation for your fabulous presentation this evening. And because you are originally from Lancaster County, we invite you to our commemoration on July 27th, 28th, and 29th. All of the events are listed on our website, Lafayette200pa.org, and you'll be so happy to know that as part of our commemoration, we have a musical performance that includes James Armistead Lafayette.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, we're excited about that. So, Tim, tonight's program has been recorded and will be made available for later viewing on our YouTube channel, Lafayette 200 Marquis Mondays. And
Could I mention my next book project? Because I
sure,
think
go
it
ahead.
will
I know you
be
were
very
going. Go
interesting
ahead.
to your viewers. Mount Vernon is doing a major new exhibition to open July 2026, next July. And I was the writer on that project for the exhibition. And so they asked me to adapt the script, is what the text panels that you read in an exhibit are called a script. So they asked me to adapt that script to a book for young readers, ages 10 to 14. So I'm writing about George Washington. So it's quite daunting, as you can imagine, because you think everything has been written about George Washington. But the fact that Mount Vernon is endorsing it and their name will be on the cover along with mine is very, very exciting. So I'm very pleased about that. So you'll have to look for that next year.
Congratulations. Do you have a title yet, Tim?
I think it's following the exhibit title, which is George Washington, A Revolutionary Life.
Excellent.
And one of our viewers this evening said to say thank you.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome.
Thanks to all of you who joined us for tonight's program. We invite you to attend our next Marquis Mondays with Jenny Coate. She's the author of the Lafayette series, The Voice, The Revolution and the Key, The Marquis, The Escape and the Fox, The Declaration and the Sword and the Spy. Until then, bonsoir. Good night, everyone.